The dust settled around her boots as Sarah Whitmore dismounted from the borrowed mare, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar street with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. 3 days of riding had brought her to this nameless collection of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of the Montana Territory, a place where the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels and the wind carried secrets it would never tell. She had come for Dancer, the blood bay mare that had been stolen from her small homestead outside Billings, the last living connection to a life that had been taken from her piece by precious piece. The town square was nothing more than a wide dirt clearing flanked by a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, and a handful of other structures that seemed to lean against each other for support. A few men loitered outside the saloon, their faces shadowed by hat brims, their eyes following her with the curiosity that strangers always drew in places like this. Sarah had grown accustomed to those stares over the past 5 years since Thomas had died, leaving her alone on 40 acres of unforgiving land with nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstance. She tied the mare to the hitching post outside the general store and pushed through the door, the familiar smell of tobacco, flour, and leather greeting her like an old acquaintance. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to measure strangers before welcoming them. Sarah approached the counter with the directness that frontier life had instilled in her. She described Dancer in detail, the distinctive white blaze down her face, the way she favored her left foreleg ever so slightly, the brand on her flank that marked her as Sarah's property. The proprietor listened with the patience of a man who had heard 1,000 similar stories, then shook his head slowly. He had seen no such horse, he said, but suggested she speak with Jack Brennan at the livery. Jack knew every animal that passed through the valley. The livery stable sat at the far end of the street, a sturdy building that smelled of hay and horse sweat and honest labor. Sarah found the owner bent over a hoof, carefully examining a shoe that needed replacing. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sun-weathered skin and hands that spoke of decades working with animals. When she cleared her throat, he looked up, and she was struck by the kindness in his eyes, a quality she had not encountered often enough in recent years. She told him about Dancer, watching his face for any flicker of recognition. Jack Brennan straightened slowly, setting down the hoof with gentle precision, and studied Sarah with an expression that seemed to see past her travel-worn clothes and sun-darkened skin to something deeper beneath. Then he asked the question that would alter everything. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant, as if he knew the weight his words would carry. "Ma'am, before I answer about your horse, I need to ask you something. If you find her, if she's here in this valley, what then? You planning to ride back to your homestead alone, or are you running from something you haven't named yet?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. No one had asked her that. No one had looked at her and seen past the determination to the fear, the loneliness, the exhaustion of 5 years spent proving she could survive when everyone expected her to fail. She opened her mouth to deliver a sharp retort, to tell this stranger that her business was her own, but the words would not come. Instead, she felt tears burning behind her eyes, and she hated herself for the weakness even as she recognized the truth in his question. She had been running. Not from anything tangible, but from the emptiness of her cabin, from the silence that pressed against her ears at night, from the weight of being 30 years old and feeling like she had already lived a lifetime of loss. Dancer's theft had given her a purpose, a mission, something beyond the daily grind of survival. But what would happen when she found the mare? Would she ride back to that lonely homestead and continue the slow erosion of her spirit? Jack must have seen the answer in her face because his expression softened. He gestured to a bench near the stable entrance and suggested they sit. Sarah found herself obeying, sinking onto the worn wood with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. That he told her that he had seen a bay mare matching Dancer's description 3 days prior, brought in by a drifter who had traded her for supplies and moved on. The mare was now in the possession of a rancher named Samuel Cortez, who ran cattle in the high meadows and had been looking for good breeding stock. Jack had recognized immediately that the horse was too fine, too well trained, to have belonged to the man who brought her in, but such transactions were common in the territories, and asking too many questions could bring trouble. Sarah felt relief and rage wash over her in equal measure. Dancer was here, was safe, but had been sold as if she were nothing more than currency. She stood abruptly, thanking Jack and asking directions to the Cortez ranch. But Jack stood as well, his hand raised in a gesture that asked for patience. That he told her that Samuel Cortez was a fair man but proud, and approaching him with accusations would accomplish nothing. Better, Jack suggested, to let him introduce them, to frame the situation as a misunderstanding rather than a theft. Samuel would not knowingly keep stolen property, Jack said, but he would need to be approached with respect. Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to ride up to that ranch and demand what was rightfully hers, but something in Jack's steady gaze convinced her to trust his judgment. The next morning, Jack accompanied her to the Cortez ranch, riding beside her on a sturdy gelding and filling the journey with conversation that felt like water after a long drought. He told her about the valley, about the families who had settled here and the delicate balance they maintained between cooperation and independence. He asked about her life, and she found herself talking more than she had in years, describing the homestead, the garden she coaxed from reluctant soil, the loneliness that sometimes felt like a physical weight. Samuel Cortez met them in front of a sprawling ranch house surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. He was a man in his 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and a bearing that suggested both authority and fairness. Jack made the introductions carefully, explaining the situation with a diplomacy that Sarah grudgingly admired. Samuel listened without interruption, his dark eyes moving from Jack to Sarah and back again. When Jack finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he called for one of his hands to bring the bay mare from the upper pasture. They waited in silence, and Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. When Dancer appeared, trotting down the hillside with her distinctive gait, Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The mare saw her and whinnied, breaking into a canter that brought her directly to Sarah's side, pushing her velvet nose against Sarah's shoulder with unmistakable recognition. Samuel needed no further proof. He apologized immediately, explaining that he had paid good money for the horse but would not keep what belonged to another. Sarah tried to reimburse him, digging into the small leather pouch where she kept her savings, but Samuel waved her away. He had been deceived, he said, and that was the risk of doing business in the territories. He would recover his loss from the man who had cheated him if their paths ever crossed again. As Sarah prepared to leave, Dancer's reins in her hand and her heart fuller than it had been in years, Samuel made her an offer. He needed someone to manage his horse breeding program, someone with a gentle touch and an understanding of good bloodlines. The work would come with a small cabin on the ranch property, a fair wage, and the opportunity to work with some of the finest horses in the territory. He had watched how Dancer responded to her, Samuel said, and that told him everything he needed to know about Sarah's skills. Sarah looked at Jack, who offered only an encouraging nod, leaving the decision entirely to her. She thought about her homestead, the lonely cabin and the struggling garden, the years she had spent proving she could survive alone. She thought about what survival meant, whether merely continuing was enough when the possibility of actually living beckoned from an unexpected direction. She accepted Samuel's offer, and the relief that washed over her felt like being reborn. Over the following weeks, she settled into the rhythm of ranch life, working with the horses and discovering a talent she had never fully explored. Samuel was a patient teacher, and the other ranch hands accepted her with the casual camaraderie of people who judged others by their work rather than their history. She sold her homestead to a young family eager for their own piece of land, and with that transaction, she severed the last chain binding her to a life that had been about endurance rather than purpose. Jack Brennan became a fixture in her new life, stopping by the ranch regularly under various pretenses, staying for dinner, talking with her late into the evening about everything and nothing. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to anticipate someone's arrival, to feel her spirits lift at the sound of a familiar voice. She had armored herself against disappointment for so long that recognizing hope felt dangerous, like touching something that might burn. One evening, as they sat on the porch of her new cabin watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jack spoke about loneliness. He talked about how it could become a habit, a familiar companion that felt safer than risking connection. He talked about his own years of solitude after losing his wife to fever, about the way he had convinced himself that he preferred his own company when in truth he was simply afraid of losing someone again. Sarah understood that he was not just talking about himself. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening after being locked for too long. They sat like that as darkness fell and stars emerged, neither needing to say what they both understood. The seasons turned, and Sarah flourished in ways she had never imagined possible. The horse breeding program thrived under her management, and her reputation spread through the territory. Young women began seeking her out, asking how she had built her skills, how she had found her place in a world that so often tried to make women small and silent. Sarah told them the truth, that she had not found her place so much as created it, that strength came not from never falling but from choosing to rise again and again. Jack asked her to marry him on a clear autumn morning when the aspens blazed gold against the mountainside. Sarah said yes without hesitation, no longer afraid of what she might lose, focused instead on what she had found. They wed in a simple ceremony attended by Samuel, the ranch hands, and the scattered families who had become her community. She wore a dress the color of cream and carried wildflowers picked from the high meadows, and when Jack kissed her, she tasted possibility and promise. Years later, when people asked Sarah about how her life had changed, she always returned to that moment in the livery stable when Jack had asked his question. She had arrived in that nameless town searching for a stolen horse, driven by anger and determination and the need to reclaim something that belonged to her. But Jack's question had forced her to confront a deeper truth, that she had been searching for more than just answer, that she had been looking for permission to want something beyond mere survival. She never regretted the years she had spent alone on her homestead, the proving ground where she had discovered her own strength. But she also understood that strength meant knowing when to stop fighting, when to accept help, when to allow yourself to be seen and known and loved. The frontier taught harsh lessons about self-reliance, but it also revealed that true courage sometimes meant opening yourself to connection, to community, to the possibility that you did not have to carry every burden alone. On summer evenings, Sarah would stand in the corrals working with the young horses, teaching them to trust human hands, to accept the saddle and bridle with grace rather than fear. Jack would watch from the fence rail, his presence a steady comfort, and sometimes she would catch his eye and remember that moment when everything changed, when a simple question had cracked open her carefully constructed defenses and let the light pour in. Dancer lived to a ripe old age, producing a line of exceptional foals that became sought after throughout the territory. Sarah often told people that the mare had led her to exactly where she needed to be, that the theft had been a blessing disguised as a loss. She meant it. Sometimes the universe conspired in mysterious ways, taking what seemed essential and replacing it with something you had not known to want, something that transformed not just your circumstances but your very understanding of what a life could hold. The town that had once been nameless became home, the strangers became family, and the woman who had arrived searching for a stolen horse discovered that what she had truly been seeking was herself, the version of herself that could accept love and offer it in return, that could build rather than simply survive, that could trust in tomorrow despite all the yesterdays that had taught her otherwise. And every time she told her story, Sarah made sure to emphasize that single question, the one that had changed everything. What then? What comes after you find what you are looking for? It was a question she carried with her always, a reminder that the finding was never the ending, but rather the beginning of something new, something worth all the dust and distance and difficult days that brought you to the threshold of transformation.